Hey, thanks for being a part of the conversation. Let's do some pod crashing. Episode number 329 is with Scott Weinberger from the podcast Cold Blooded. Good morning, Scott. How are you doing today?
Good. I thought you were talking about me, Rockstar. I mean, it was just, I'm more into glamping.
That's me. I have a 28-foot RV, so therefore, it's not really camping. When the sun goes down, I go in and watch Hulu.
There you go. I'm with you. Great to talk to you, though.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you because, you are, I swear that what you've got here is a good brain game. Not only for you to go and do the investigating, but for we as listeners, we're trying to piece this all together as well. And you put our brains in places that take us out of this real world.
Yeah, it is an interesting look inside a case that really, in a sense, if it spans back almost 40 years to a different time, Arrow. You're talking about in the mid-'80s where in South Florida it was more like Miami Vice meets Goodfellas, and trying to pick apart some of the investigation that was originally done and why so many people were afraid to come forward then. Now we've been fortunate enough that when we're locating these witnesses who have been involved, and even members of the Apollo Gym gang who may have been involved back then in some nefarious criminal activity, are now willing to talk, and it's really guiding us to a resolution, I believe, in this homicide investigation.
That gym, oh my God, that opened my eyes, making me wonder if my gym is something like this, where the cops and the crooks come together as one.
Yeah, it was a place where that was it. It wasn't like your local LA Fitness or things that you would normally go to today. The air conditioning didn't work. Most of the equipment was broken, but these were serious bodybuilders. And you could buy steroids right out of the bathroom there. And they were just getting bulked up. And the cops there who were working out probably knew a lot more than they ever admitted to, and the criminals probably felt safer than they ever did because the cops were not moving in on them at the time.
Wow. When you jumped into Cold Blooded, the podcast, you had to answer the questions yourself. Who, what, where, why, and when?
I did, and I think I needed to have a general idea of, and because it's normally when you look into a cold case, you don't want the previous investigator's opinions. Right. You want to start formulating your own opinions. It's like covering a case in news. You could read articles about how other journalists covered it, but if you start looking into it, it may jade your opinion about how you want to approach the case. It's the same with a cold case, fresh set of eyes, as they call it. You go in and start formulating your own opinions. And interestingly enough, we started formulating our own opinions early on in this investigation to determine that not necessarily anything was done wrong, but that they didn't have a lot to work with because nobody wanted to talk. There was no real one big interview back in the 80s that led them down the path that we've been led to in the last 2 years.
Yeah, but the 1980s, I remember it vividly because, Florida was changing unbelievably fast. You had so many people coming into the country and leaving that state. It's like, who had a relationship with anybody?
Right. It's still definitely a transient state in a sense where people come down there, they spend time, and then they either settle there or they just move on to somewhere else. And, there's a lot of different tentacles that happen in this case having to do with organized crime, having to do with cartels, having to do with members of law enforcement that were not acting in a proud way for the office that they held. So it was a really interesting mixture with a backdrop of like sort of Miami Vice, as I mentioned, because there was a lot of cocaine, a lot of marijuana, a lot of drugs fueling a lot of this behavior.
Even Charlotte has its own darkest sides, but I would never go walking into it. How did you find the courage to go into this side of the city? Because, it was dark.
Yeah, I ultimately looking at it on paper and just trying to determine who were the most important people to speak to.
Yeah.
Listen, the weight of the investigation is on the police department. Detective Danny Smith in this case is a 27-year veteran of the Miramar Police Department, is a member of a SWAT team. He is tactically perfect. His way into investigations is impressive. So I was along for the ride and just really seeing the way that he would unfold each aspect of it, and then giving me the opportunity to really be embedded and capture some of the most, I think, incredible audio real time as you're knocking on doors and people are saying, it's about time you guys showed up. I mean, this has been forever. I thought Billy Halpern, I thought you guys forgot about him.
I can't imagine that experience when someone says, dude, I've been here for a long time. What's happening?
Yeah, and of course, calling Billy's sister on the phone originally, after we had spent about a month opening the investigation before we reached out to her, just to see, we didn't want to make any promises that we hopefully couldn't, keep. So just the first phone call with her was so emotional. Yeah. And, her parents had passed away, which is Billy's parents. They didn't know who or what was going to ever happen with Billy. His reputation of just being at the Apollo gym was tainted because all of these murders were happening. 5 murders within a span of a year. So what was Billy into? Was he part of some bad ring? And thankfully, through Detective Smith's work, I think his sister Lori now finally has some answers.
See, I was going to ask you about the family, did you have to negotiate a deal with them for them to come out and talk? But now I've got a better understanding of how it was all laid out.
Yeah, it really wasn't like approaching them, do you want to do a podcast? Embedded in an investigation to see what we had. Because it wasn't a podcast until it was a story.
Right.
And it wasn't a story until it actually began, and I think I say I was so shocked. I've never been more shocked in any case I've ever covered in my career. It's a long time. Unfortunately, I admit that. It's a long time. As I am with this case, because of the surprise of how the expectations of maybe some investigations that should have happened that didn't happen. Maybe it's about some members of law enforcement that may have, I don't want to say look the other way because I don't have evidence of that. However, we do know that some things occurred within this investigation that held it back. Some of it is related to science. It's clear. Science has changed over 37 years. And sat in a locker that has really, in a sense, it has never been tested. So that was my first real important ask to Detective Smith. Is there any forensic evidence that has never been tested that can be tested in this case? Because to me, that is one of the most important stories, is what we can do today could not have been done 37 years ago. And that could potentially finally bring justice to the family of Billy Halpern.
Scott, you bring up a very interesting point there, because you and I are old enough to know that DNA was not that big thing when we were growing up. We didn't know what the hell that was. And then all of a sudden now we're solving these crimes. And that's exactly what happened here. The DNA of the killer is exposed inside this podcast.
It is. And, I remember as a member of law enforcement, towards the end of my career, but to think that some work done by members of law enforcement back then, preserving, in a sense, gloving up correctly, preserving evidence, is solving cases, not just this case, but many of the cases that I do on my other show, Anatomy of Murder, are solved based on some of the really, really good work done by, the person on scene, the crime scene investigators, the collectors of the technical crimes unit, that stuff making a difference.
It's so easy to go to drugs and sex, but you're proving something differently here.
Yeah, it's definitely something differently. And the motive is pretty shocking. Mm-hmm. And the aspect of how it developed is even more shocking, to be honest with you. So it unfolds over the 10 episodes. And I promise to anyone who's interested in diving in from episode 1 and making an investment, because, this is an investment of time. And I think such a worthy investment, because it's very rare that you get to hear this, not just being told by somebody. You actually witness it yourself, because it unfolds actually with audio, knocking on doors, talking to witnesses. And as we discover these new pieces of important evidence, you're discovering them along with us.
What kind of tools did you use? Because I'm a Zoom guy and I also use Spreaker to get my sound. But don't you also have that fear inside of you when it comes to when you're recording, you're going, oh my God, somebody could come back and get me on this because I didn't tell them I was recording?
No, the police department records everything they do.
Okay.
Technology today is different, and it's normal for a homicide investigator to gather his evidence and not do shorthand, right? To be able to record what they needed. I would always make my presence known. Clearly, I'm a journalist. I'm responsible to handle certain things certain ways, and for things that I know that would end up being valuable, I would cross my T's and dot my I's and do all those things. However, this is not a sophisticated audio gathering system, but that's what makes it special too. Because if it sounds too perfect, it doesn't really feel like it's perfect. It should not be the thing. It's capturing something. It's sort of like, when we walked on the moon, the video back then wasn't great. Yeah, it wasn't perfect. But just what you got was such an incredible perspective of what the astronauts felt as they stepped off that ladder. This is, everything is captured here in real time, and we want to preserve the authenticity of that.
I always call that taking the listener someplace, because I truly believe that. I mean, I had an interview one time with Dennis Quaid. He was washing his dishes. Didn't piss me off. I was sitting there going, this is awesome. We're washing dishes.
I agree.
And that's what I love about, and that could be my attraction to this podcast when I get in the car and I've got to go to the next episode. But what am I going to do?
You're going to appreciate, I think, the lengths that a member of law enforcement it goes through to be able to take, could be 2.5 years of his career. And even though he's working other cases, he's not just working specifically one case. But the journey to justice is not a straight line.
Talking with Gil inside the prison, what was that like for you personally? Because, to me, we see the Hollywood version of what prison is, and, Orange is the New Black. What did you experience?
Okay, so I wasn't actually at that interview based on my status in this investigation. So Detective Danny Smith went in with another detective to do that specific interview. But I have done plenty of prison interviews as a journalist. And I can tell you in just listening to the beginning to the end of the recording that Detective Smith did, and in talking to him when he was sitting in the parking lot, we were going over some of the things that he wanted to talk about and some of the things that he felt was important. There's certainly there's a nervousness no matter how many times you've done it. Yep. You're not expecting, you don't know if the person is going to come out, because they have the right to refuse to talk to you, not just the legal right, but they have the right to come in and say, I respectfully decline to talk. So there wasn't really an idea of that 8-hour drive it took to get to the prison from whether it would be 8 long hours back because he wouldn't come out. But I will say that Gil Fernandez was extremely respectful to Detective Danny Smith, both being members of law enforcement, Gil obviously at one time. And I do think there's a matter of trying to read the room for both of them.
When you put a show like this together, are you thinking about the receiver, the listener? Only because, really, in all honesty, when it comes to law enforcement, this is one of those podcasts where I swear that police officers need to be studying.
I did want to give that behind the curtain look, so to speak, of how and what it takes to take a cold case from 40 years ago and reopen it and start from zero. When I was recording it originally, I did not think of that. It was once I gathered all the materials and laid it out like I would a cold case investigation on the table and started figuring out how I was going to tell this story is when I realized that the most important part of it, and I think you just mentioned when I appreciate that, which is taking the listener audibly into the car, opening the door, hearing the radio in the background, walking, knocking on the door, introducing himself, getting that first reaction from the person saying, why are you talking to me? Yeah. Am I in trouble? I mean, that was 40 years ago. I don't remember anything. But then you sit down with them and you start to bring up names and show them pictures, right? And then when you do that, you look in their face, and this is what their perspective is. Unfortunately, you can't do it in podcasting, but you get a sense, and I think we do a good job in telling that portion of the story, is what the language that comes across in the room feels like. And we have all of that in real time. And I think we do a good job in actually bringing the emotion of that connection and that first call or that first knock on the door in through the podcast.
Yeah, you're definitely setting the standard here. You're raising the bar when it comes to this kind of journalism, because, I mean, so many times in the past, we relied on music in the background, dramatic music, and we relied on fake acting and things like that. But I mean, you really bring the authenticity to a podcast like this. And I think that's what makes it kind of scary to listen to.
Yeah. Listen, I think I always have a rule in music when it comes to whether it's podcasting or television, and the music should be supporting the story and not become the story. Although in this case, we are in a journey that's 40 years old. So I do want you to feel what it was like back in the 80s too.
Yeah.
So without it being too over the top, I do think there's these turns that we make in transitions from our perspective of storytelling. We're talking about an emotional sister or the victim, where she is realizing that all of these things are coming back full front for her. And, it's a journey musically that would be different than all of a sudden we found a new clue and we've got an investigative cue in there just to take the listener on. Because my hope is, and like with the other show, Anatomy of Murder, is like you're driving to work on your way and you end up sitting in the parking lot for a few extra minutes just so you can finish. And I've done my job, if that's true.
God, 20 minutes with you is not enough. Dude, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future.
Happy to.
Excellent. Well, you be brilliant today, okay, Scott? And thank you so much for doing Cold Blooded, because once again, this is raising the bar when it comes to this kind of reporting.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You bet. You be brilliant today, okay, sir?
Thank you.